Hello, my name's Mark Farrington. I'm Group Vice President with GlobalLogic, with responsibility for UK and Ireland, our customers and our services offered within that market. I'm joined today by Jacob Morgan of Forrester. We commissioned you, Jacob, to do a report for us on the future belongs to the adaptive organisation in 2021. Tell us a little bit about that report.
Yeah, sure, and thank you for inviting me to talk about it. So it was a really interesting study, and I think the first thing really is to put it in context. It was done in really the middle portion of 2021, so it was just as we were starting to get into a steady state with the pandemic. It went out to about 259 people within the European market, so it was looking at director plus up to C-level executives. So that was really a little bit of the context. And we were really interested in understanding where firms were with their digital transformation. So particularly financial services firms, which made up about 80% of the study. And then the other 20% was energy and waste management firms, energy, utilities and waste management. And it was really interesting. It gave us some of the insights that we will perhaps anticipate, but also some really interesting unexpected results, which I think was down to the timing of the study. One of those results that was quite unexpected was a fifth of the respondents said that they didn't believe that their digital strategy would outlast the 12-month period that they were in. And we largely think this was down to exactly when we did the study. People were coming out of the pandemic after that sort of mass reorganization and digitization, which meant that they were now in a position of looking at what the impact had been on their customers and having to perhaps rethink some of the strategies that they had, reposition some of the services or the tools that they had. So that timing really influenced that. But top of their strategy was growth, and that was closely followed by being an adaptive organization. So putting things in place like agile delivery capability, DevOps that would allow them to quickly reconfigure their organization.
Jacob, we saw a lot of reactive response to the pandemic from organisations, both from an employee perspective in terms of how they engage with their employees and kept them engaged as a workforce, but also their customer base as well in terms of mobile channels, digital channels.
Yeah.
How have they adapted those digital strategies since the pandemic?
So since the pandemic, we've seen a big focus on the handoffs really, because one of the challenges that we had during the pandemic itself was it was a massive call to action. So shortcuts were taken. People were implementing services, implementing solutions that perhaps weren't optimal or were built on foundations that would otherwise have been retired, so perpetuating legacy. So as we came out of the pandemic, the focus was really starting to shift to how do we really refactor for the steady state? How do we ensure that we're making sure customer experiences and processes flow smoothly? There's not the bit of digital that we delivered as a result of the pandemic finishing in an analog process, for example, or all of those little bits where you had someone coming into branch as a financial services firm are now replaced by a scalable and robust service that fulfills the needs that they have. So we've seen that sort of refactoring of strategy, refactoring of roadmaps more than strategy, because I think the strategy tends to remain relatively persistent despite what people were saying about it being something that would only live for the 12 months. I think they probably got a little bit of confusion in there between the roadmap, how you deliver against your strategy, and the strategy itself. The strategy really meant that a lot of digitization was pulled forward and delivered earlier on the roadmap. But the strategy to digitize hasn't changed that fundamentally. And that was one of the other things that we found in the study, that unfortunately some of the typical challenges, because we asked people, what are the issues you're facing in your digitization, and some of the typical challenges are perennial, they're persisting. So we saw half of the respondents flagging issues that they had with legacy systems. 40% couldn't get the budget to fix those legacy systems. We had issues that were reported around getting executive buy-in to digitization, which, as we know, you have to have buy-in throughout the organization to align in the direction in which you want to go. We also positively, though, saw a real recognition of the importance of digital culture, or the culture of the organization, which is really refreshing, because Peter Drucker, I think it was, once said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And they, 87% of respondents were saying, we are really prioritizing digitizing our culture and thinking differently about how we deliver products and services to our customers, and also how we enable our employees internally, because that was also part of the focus, not just customer experience, but the digitization of the back office, the digitization and support of the home working that everyone was now forced to do.
And how do you see them perhaps adapting further now we're out of that pandemic phase, but into a hybrid working phase with agile working practices? How's that beginning to show through, do you find?
So we're definitely seeing more focus on some of the fundamentals in terms of how should development be done. So the practices around agile or iterative design development methodologies. They're also being augmented by things like design thinking and processes that flow the insight back into the organization. Because some of the sort of core things around a digitized strategy is that you're actually, in essence, putting the guardrails out there with the strategy to enable the organization itself and the people that are closer to the customers, closer to where the work is being done in their reasonably autonomous Scrum teams or Agile teams or whatever methodology you're using. They have more control over how they deliver. So it's important to give them those guardrails and put those in place so that they can work more effectively at resolving the issues in their sprints that present themselves. But the other thing, and this also came through in the study, is that it's really important to give them insight and information as to what is happening from a customer experience perspective. And we certainly saw that there were issues around this. So from a customer experience perspective, people knew the importance of that. They knew just how fundamental customer experience is to the success of the organization, the longevity of the brand. But they also had real issues in driving data back to the front office, back to the back office, to enable their employees to then take the right decisions, understand whether what they're building is actually having the desired results and the anticipated results.
And do you think that significant event of the pandemic has driven a change in the relationship between the front-end business part of the organisation and the technology teams developing the platforms for that business?
I definitely think that, yes, is the short answer. We saw a real collapsing of businesses into a single cohesive unit with a very defined fundamental goal. The pandemic, for many firms, was existential, digitize or die. And when you've got that sort of unifying singularity of purpose, it brings people together. It also helps them remove the roadblocks to sort of work towards a single common goal. And everything becomes about that one North Star, essentially. So we definitely saw the business responding to the issues that they had as an organization, the technology team responding to the issues also at an organizational level, but also at a supporting the organization level. So not just enabling for the external customers, but also enabling for the internal organization. And that did bring people together because they had the mandate to do things differently, to think differently, to be more creative in how they resolve some of the issues. But that then buys you another host of problems, because back to what I was saying at the start, you end up with some suboptimal decisions or shortcuts that were taken that you then have to remediate later, which is kind of where we are now.
So you talk about a singularity of purpose across the organisation from a business and a technology perspective. Have we seen that continuing post-pandemic, and how are those two parts of the organisation coming together to innovate in terms of services and product offerings for organisations?
So we've seen it sort of continue, but in a slightly staccato way, if that makes sense. So what I mean by that is you had that singularity of purpose under COVID and the pandemic. You then had people prioritising growth as their top sort of strategic objective, imagining they were coming out of the pandemic. Since then, since the study in 2021, we've had further black swan events. A flock of black swans has descended with, obviously the war in Ukraine and all of the issues that have then spawned from that, with energy crisis and the high cost of living and inflation. So people have had other issues that they've now had to focus and now had to sort of address. So you've seen the organisation sort of perhaps break apart a little, but then come back together to look at some of these challenges in the initial response. But now we're in a position where organisations are in a run state that has to deal with high inflation. There are a few sort of positive signals coming, but there's no definite end date yet. So there's now actually, again, a little bit of a bifurcation between technology and business, though a lot of the good practice of people working together in a more kind of leveled way, because they're actually collaborating through collaboration technologies, because a lot of people are still working from home, that's actually quite leveling. You don't get a kind of them and us of people in a project room and people outside the project. You get more consistency in terms of how people are interacting. So it's a little bit of swings and roundabouts, if that makes sense.
And do you see the focus on innovation to continue on the growth phase, or do you see it around optimization? How should we think about that?
Yeah, it's definitely the latter. I mean, this is a big shift and something that we've written about in our predictions this year. We are seeing, particularly in adaptive organizations, which really focus on how they can build sort of configurability and flexibility into the technology to meet those emerging customer needs and meet the existing customer needs. Those adaptive organizations are really focusing on how innovation can now be more purposeful within the organization. So it's less kind of jazz hands and hoverboards, if you like. It's less the moonshot. It's more the pragmatism about what is the fundamental business problem we're trying to resolve? What is it our customers need from us? And how can we use innovation and bring our innovation power to bear to help us solve those problems? So the importance hasn't changed at all. It's just the focus of what the innovation team is being asked to look at now has shifted to deliver really some of those pragmatic opportunities that drive the business forward, but meet those customer needs, and ideally provide some reusability, some flexibility, or something else of longevity within the organization that reduces cost. But on the cost front, we're actually seeing from a recent spot survey we did at Forrester that from a technology perspective, budgets are up. I think even for 25%, for a quarter of the people that responded to our Forrester survey, budgets are predicted to be 5% higher next year. So there isn't a budget cut. It's just more about how you spend your money more wisely and more effectively. And the focus really has to be on how to meet those customer needs and those business objectives.
When you talk about those customer needs and business objectives and spending still increasing, how does that play against the trends that you see coming through for 2023 as Forrester? What would you say are those top trends that play into that?
So I think one of the trends that we're definitely seeing is a bit of a talent crunch, which again can drive costs up. Costs need to be controlled. So we're starting to see businesses look more widely in terms of their hiring opportunities, for example. So using some of the marketplaces, developer marketplaces and things like that to source talent, but also leveraging their partners more effectively. So what we started to see in the before the pandemic, but what we're seeing more and more now is firms working with their partners more as a partnership rather than a supplier and buyer relationship. Not all of their partners, the partners that are perhaps more aligned to helping them be successful. So they're being a little bit more picky about what they're doing with partners and how they can focus those partners in on driving forward innovation alongside them, or using some of their services from the point of view, for example, of commodity-based services. So they're, you as a firm yourself can focus your development talent on things that are most important to you, and other elements can be delivered by an as-a-service provider or another capability platform. So we're starting to see some of the technologies really bear fruit, and some of that platform approach and that sort of ecosystem as a service approach deliver more effectively or allow people to optimize how they deliver, essentially.
So outside of the technology trends and the people trends, one of the big focus areas for many organisations we talk to is around environmental and sustainability goals.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you see that playing through?
Yeah, I mean that was something that featured in our study back in 2021. So, there at that point, the focus was more on really making environmental and sustainable goals or sustainability part of what the business was doing. So there were initiatives underway that a lot of people reported on sustainability. Post the start of the Ukraine war and with the energy shocks we have now, there's even more of a focus. So sustainability and environmental factors really matter. We genuinely need alternative models for the fundamental energy propositions that we have as countries, as businesses. But within that, we also have on the human side and on the business side more sensitivity to cost. Everything costs more as a result of inflation. We're all paying the price for what's happened. And consequently, we're starting to see more firms dedicate time and resource into financial well-being programs, for example, within financial services, utilizing open finance data to get a better picture of the business or the company or the individual's financial position, for example. So environmental and sustainable is often what people think about, but there's also that purposeful angle as well, which really is where you can drive a greater level of trust with your customers, because people remember who went out of their way to help them. So there's actually a real opportunity now for many firms to put this sort of distributed ecosystem model into play with that lens of environmental and sustainable and purposeful development to drive solutions that really make a difference for their customers, really help them identify spend that they don't need to have, for example, or help a company understand where it's energy inefficient or how it could perhaps model its consumption of energy differently, for example.
Which can be challenging, certainly in the tech space, as people are moving from data centers that they perhaps own, operate and understand what the consumption profile looks like, to public cloud-based solutions whereby it may be more efficient but is a little bit more opaque in terms of being able to measure.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
One of the areas that we see focus is around the triple bottom line. Is a conversation that we have with our customers quite often. It's not just about the prosperity of their organisation, but it's also about planetary impact. How green are the solutions that we're deploying? And what's the impact to the people? Both from a customer perspective, but also from their own employee perspective.
Yes, absolutely. And it does, we only inhabit one planet, and it's everybody's duty effectively to manage that well. And we are starting to see on that employee experience side and on the talent attraction side, people, not just customers, but employees voting with their feet. They don't want to be associated with a firm that has bad environmental practices or is seen negatively or is indeed doing bad things. So we're definitely starting to see that. And it's interesting that also steps over into the world of things like consumer privacy and use of data. So it's not just the impact on the planet, it's also the impact on the individual and the person as a result of data breaches, data inefficiency, not actually taking due diligence and care of data and information as you should. And we're starting to see a bit of a backlash in terms of consumer trust, which incidentally was built up higher in the pandemic because everyone was using these tools. And counterintuitively, people were actually, the older generation were quite comfortable with mobile or contactless payments or being served online. It actually suited them once they had the impetus to jump onto that bandwagon. Trust went up. Trust is now falling because we are seeing scandals where data breaches have taken place or data has been used or algorithms have been unethical or questionable. And this is now there's more consumer awareness of this, and there's more consumer awareness of things like open finance, where you're providing consent for certain services or a payment. So people notice when they're perhaps being not necessarily taken for a ride, but there is a growing awareness of how they should be treated, and drawing comparisons between firms as to who's doing it, which of the many companies they put their business with.
And people are becoming much more aware of their own personal data as well, and
yeah.
targeted marketing as well. They're becoming very aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we all talk about digital transformation and the impact it's having on business and our own personal lives. A number of different industries have moved early with digital transformation, retail, publishing being two examples. Other industries that are more heavily regulated, financial services, energy, utilities, perhaps further down the curve than those initial early adopters. How does being regulated play to the strengths for them in terms of digital transformation?
I think it's an interesting question because regulation can kind of cut both ways. On the one hand, it gives you as a regulated entity, as a bank or a utility firm, a constant dripping tap of expenditure that you have to, whether you like it or not, undertake in order to remain in compliance. And that can be quite costly. It increases your run the engine costs, it reduces discretionary spend. On the other hand, you also, because of being a regulated entity, tend to have more controlled and more effective change management processes. So you tend to operate, if you've got your sort of digital natives down here that are perhaps a little bit more, they're not as controlled, whereas your bank absolutely has
less
to do
encumbered
everything.
by regulation.
Yeah, exactly. They have very, very precise definitions of how they need to perform, what the auditors need to see, etc., etc. That is actually beginning to become slightly advantageous because it means that they're in a stronger position now with the, some of the services that they've built, the technologies they've built, how they've implemented them. But also we're starting to see some large firms, including the large tech firms, shed some of their workforce. They are, putting people back out into the market. Some of those people have been, their next career step is actually to work with a more regulated organization that has some of the big challenges that the banks and utility firms have. So they get the interest in terms of what jobs can offer them and what problems they're working on, but they also get the good practices that also is great for them to grow and develop in a different way. So it can actually work to your advantage to be in that heavily regulated space because you're likely to be more controlled, and it's now becoming something of an attraction as some of those people become available.
A little bit more structured, deliberate, persistent
in
terms of the adoption of that transformation.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And again, there's still that sort of idea of building the North Star, understanding where you want to go. Perhaps the regulated entity has fewer pathways to get there, shall we say? But they still have a lot of creativity, and they also have a lot of consumer touch points. That is, again, an interesting thing for people to work on.
Thank you. Really appreciate your time and the insight. Thank you for the support from Forrester and yourself.
Thank you.
Jake.